The mining drills had been silent for 3 days now. Deep beneath the surface of Tellus 7, something had gone terribly wrong when the excavation team broke through into what they thought was just another mineral deposit. Instead, they had opened a gateway to hell itself. Mining supervisor. Kale pressed his back against the sealed blast door, listening to the scratching sounds coming from the other side. His breathing created small clouds in the cold air as the life support systems struggled to maintain atmosphere in the emergency shelters. Behind him, nearly 3,000 colonists huddled in the reinforced habitat domes that were never meant to house so many people for so long. The creatures had poured out of that breach like a living nightmare. Acid burned through metal as easily as paper, claws that could tear through reinforced bulkheads. Worst of all, they seemed to learn from each attack, adapting their tactics with frightening intelligence. The security teams had lasted exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes before the last transmission went dead. Communication Officer Lisa worked frantically at her console, sending distress signals across every frequency she could access. The responses came back like automated rejections from a job application. The Centauran Defense Force regretted they had no available ships in the sector. The Trade Guild expressed sympathy, but cited insurance complications. Even the Galactic Peace Corps suggested they contact local authorities, apparently unaware that the local authorities were currently being dissolved by alien stomach acid. "Any word from the evacuation ships that got out?" Kale asked, though he already knew the answer from Lisa's expression. 2 made it to the jump point before the creatures reached the landing bays. The others. She gestured helplessly at her screen showing debris fields in orbit. At least 800 people made it out, maybe more. That left over 3,000 still trapped. Food supplies would last another week if they were careful, water for maybe 10 days. But the real problem was the habitat dome's structural integrity. Each day brought new vibrations through the ground as the creatures tested the barriers, looking for weak points with the patience of dedicated engineers. "Keep broadcasting," Kale ordered. "Someone has to be willing to help." Hours passed with nothing but polite refusals and expressions of sympathy. Then Lisa's console chimed with an incoming transmission from a system her computer labeled with warning markers. The source was listed as Earth, Sol System, with additional notes about quarantine protocols and danger classifications. "Sir, I'm getting a response from, well, the database says it's from the Deathworlder planet." Every alien in the shelter turned toward the communications station. Earth was legendary throughout the galaxy, though not for good reasons. Stories spread in trading posts about the violent species that had fought 3 different first contact wars before agreeing to voluntary isolation. Most civilized beings considered them barely controlled savages who solved problems by applying overwhelming force until the problems stopped existing. Put it through, Kale decided. Desperate situations called for desperate solutions. The voice that came through the speakers was calm and steady, with an accent that made some words sound clipped and precise. "This is Earth Command responding to your distress call. We've analyzed your situation based on the data you transmitted. Help is on the way." "Help?" Lisa stammered. "But we're over 300 light years from your system. How could you possibly—" "We have assets closer than you might think. Hold your position and keep your people away from the Eastern Cavern Network. We'll handle the pest problem." The transmission ended before anyone could ask what they meant by pest problem, or how they could respond so quickly to a crisis on the far side of the galaxy. Word spread through the crowded shelters like wildfire. The humans were coming. Reactions ranged from desperate hope to absolute terror. Everyone had heard the stories about human military doctrine, their casual attitude toward violence, their tendency to escalate any conflict until their enemies were completely destroyed rather than merely defeated. Engineer Tom from Mining Station 7 had actually met humans once during a trade negotiation on the Rim worlds. "They're not like us," he told the gathered crowd. They don't think in terms of acceptable losses or proportional responses. When they decide to solve a problem, they keep applying pressure until the problem ceases to exist in any recognizable form. Outside the habitat domes, the scratching sounds grew louder. Through the reinforced viewports, they could see movement in the shadows between the broken mining equipment. The creatures were getting bolder, testing the barriers more frequently. Time was running out. 3 days later, long-range sensors detected something approaching the system. It wasn't the rescue fleet most had expected. It was a single ship, but unlike anything in the galactic databases, where most vessels followed smooth, efficient designs that minimized energy signatures and presented elegant profiles, this ship looked like it had been built specifically for war. Angular surfaces deflected sensor sweeps. Weapon hardpoints bristled from every available surface. The hull itself seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, making the ship appear as a dark slash against the starfield. Most unsettling of all, it moved with predatory grace, adjusting course with the confidence of something that had never needed to flee from a fight. Unknown vessel, this is Mining Supervisor Kale of Tellus 7 Colonial Operations. Are you the assistants from Earth Command? Confirmed. This is Captain Reed aboard the UES Vindication. We're here to extract your people and deal with your infestation problem. What's your current status? Kale quickly briefed them on the situation, the number of trapped colonists, the dwindling supplies, and the increasingly aggressive behavior of the creatures. He tried to convey the desperate nature of their situation without sounding completely hopeless. Understood. We'll need approximately 36 hours to prepare the operational area. Keep your people clear of the eastern sector during this time period. We'll be conducting preliminary site preparation. What kind of preparation? We have sensitive equipment down there, geological surveys, research data. Had. Captain Reed's voice corrected gently. You had those things. After we're done, that entire sector will need to be classified as uninhabitable for the next several decades, but your people will be alive to file insurance claims. The transmission ended, leaving the colonists to contemplate what the humans considered appropriate site preparation for a rescue operation. Through the viewports, they watched the dark ship take position above their world like a mechanical bird of prey preparing to strike. Whatever happened next, Kale thought it was going to be unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. The first indication that something unusual was about to happen came when every piece of electronic equipment in the habitat domes began displaying the same warning message in bright red text. Danger. Clear all personnel from eastern sectors. Bombardment commencing in T-minus 60 minutes. Mining engineer Dave watched the countdown timer with growing unease. Bombardment was a word that civilized species used to describe the careful surgical removal of obstacles using precisely calibrated energy weapons. It was a technical term that implied minimal collateral damage and maximum efficiency. The humans, apparently, had a different definition. At exactly 0 hour, the sky above the Eastern Cavern network lit up like a star going nova. What followed challenged every assumption the colonists held about proportional response and surgical precision. Instead of the careful, targeted strikes they expected, the human ship unleashed what could only be described as concentrated apocalypse. Kinetic projectiles the size of shuttlecraft slammed into the ground at incredible velocity, sending shock waves that cracked the habitat dome's reinforced windows from over 5 kilometers away. The impacts created craters deep enough to swallow buildings, punching through layers of rock and metal like they were made of paper. "By all the gods," whispered geologist Sarah as she watched through the observation deck. "They're not trying to kill the creatures. They're trying to kill the planet." But the humans were just getting started. After the kinetic bombardment came something that made the watching aliens question whether they really wanted to be rescued by these particular saviors. Chemical weapons deployment began with surgical precision, flooding the cavern network with compounds that seemed designed to dissolve organic matter at the molecular level. The ground itself began to smoke as acidic cocktails ate through kilometers of infected tunnel systems. Any creature that had somehow survived the initial bombardment found itself breathing atmosphere that could strip paint from a starship hull. The very air became toxic to carbon-based life forms. Communications Officer Lisa monitored the human tactical frequency with growing fascination and horror. Their coordination was flawless, but their casual attitude toward destruction was unlike anything in her experience. Alpha Team, this is Command. Seismic readings show structural collapse in sectors 7 through 15. Switch to thermal charges for final cleanup. Copy that, Command. Should we be concerned about the mineral deposits in the area? Negative. Client has confirmed acceptable loss parameters. Continue with full sterilization protocol. Acceptable loss parameters. The humans were systematically destroying everything of value in the eastern sectors to ensure complete elimination of the threat. No civilized military would consider such massive collateral damage acceptable for a simple pest control operation. Then came the fire. Incendiary weapons turned the poisoned landscape into a vision of hell itself. Flames that burned at temperatures hot enough to melt steel swept through every tunnel, every cavern, every possible hiding place. The thermal bloom was visible from orbit as the humans essentially cremated several cubic kilometers of planet. But they still weren't finished. The final phase involved something the tactical frequency referred to as molecular disruption charges. The colonists had no idea what that meant until they saw the results. Entire sections of the cavern network simply ceased to exist, replaced by perfectly smooth-walled cavities that looked like they had been carved by some impossible geometric tool. They're rewriting the local geology, Dave observed with scientific fascination overriding his terror. Those weapons don't just destroy matter, they reorganize it at the atomic level. By the end of the second day, the seismic activity had stopped completely. The eastern sector, which had once been home to the richest mineral deposits on Tellus 7, was now a perfectly sterile wasteland that glowed faintly green under certain atmospheric conditions. Not a single life sign registered on any scanner. The human ship's communication system crackled to life with an update that was somehow both reassuring and deeply unsettling. Site preparation complete. No remaining hostiles detected. Beginning landing operations. All personnel should remain in designated safe areas during extraction procedures. Landing operations turned out to be another demonstration of human military doctrine in action. Instead of a single large transport, they deployed a fleet of smaller craft that moved like a coordinated swarm of predators. Each landing craft was armed, armored, and carried troops that looked more like mechanical warriors than rescue workers. The lead craft touched down outside the main habitat dome with mechanical precision. Its boarding ramp lowered to reveal soldiers in powered armor that made them look like walking weapons platforms. Their equipment was functional rather than elegant, designed for effectiveness rather than aesthetic appeal. Lieutenant Commander Hayes emerged from the formation, her helmet retracting to reveal a face that was simultaneously youthful and bearing the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had seen too much combat. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the same calm professionalism as Captain Reed, but with an undertone that suggested she was equally comfortable with diplomacy or directed violence. I'm here to coordinate your evacuation. The immediate area is secure, but we need to move quickly. The cleanup operation has created environmental hazards that will make this location uninhabitable for approximately 30 to 40 standard years. 30 to 40 years. The humans had solved their creature problem by making the entire region too toxic for any form of life. It was like using a nuclear weapon to kill insects, except it had actually worked. What about our equipment? Mining, Supervisor Kale asked. Our research data? The geological surveys? Hayes consulted a handheld device that looked like it could also function as a weapon if necessary. Anything in the eastern sectors is gone, completely. Anything in the central and western areas should be recoverable once we finish environmental remediation. We'll need about 6 hours to make those areas safe for standard atmospheric equipment. The evacuation proceeded with military efficiency that left the watching aliens slightly awestruck. The humans didn't just rescue people. They organized, categorized, and processed the refugees with a speed that suggested they had perfected this routine through extensive practice. Medical teams triaged the wounded with equipment that seemed decades ahead of standard galactic technology, but it was the casual conversation among the human soldiers that truly unsettled the colonists. While loading civilians into transport craft, they discussed their work with the detached professionalism of exterminators rather than soldiers. These acid spitters weren't too bad, one Marine commented to another. Remember those flying ones on Delta Prime? Size of atmospheric craft and they could burrow through solid rock? At least these stayed underground, his partner replied. The hive mind variants are always worse. Smart enough to set traps, but not smart enough to know when they're beaten. The implications were staggering. To these humans, the nightmare creatures that had devastated Tellus 7 and killed hundreds of colonists were just another routine assignment. They spoke of other infestations, other worlds, other battles with the casual tone of people discussing their daily commute. As the last transport lifted off from the poisoned surface of Tellus 7, the colonists looked down at their former home through reinforced viewports. Where once there had been thriving mining operations and research facilities, now there was only sterile wasteland marked by geometric scars that would glow softly for decades to come. The humans had kept their promise. The colonists were alive, safe, and rescued from certain death. But the price of that rescue had been the complete and utter destruction of everything they had built on Tellus 7. It was salvation through annihilation, delivered with human efficiency and absolute thoroughness. The refugee processing center aboard the human ship was unlike anything the colonists had ever experienced. Instead of the cramped, makeshift accommodations they expected, they found themselves in a facility that seemed designed specifically for handling large numbers of displaced persons. The corridors were wide enough for medical equipment to move freely. The temporary housing units provided privacy and basic amenities. Most surprisingly, everything was clean, organized, and functional. Colonial Administrator Webb found herself assigned to a debriefing session with a human intelligence officer who introduced himself simply as Major Blake. His office was sparse, but comfortable, with walls covered in star charts that showed systems she didn't recognize. Many were marked with symbols that looked distinctly military. "We need to understand exactly what happened during your initial encounter with the hostiles," Blake explained, activating a recording device that looked more sophisticated than anything in the colonial inventory. "The more details you can provide, the better we can prepare for similar situations." Webb described the breakthrough into the cavern system, the first sightings of the creatures, and the rapid collapse of their defensive perimeter. Blake listened with the focused attention of someone who had heard similar stories before, occasionally asking questions that revealed disturbing familiarity with the enemy. "You mentioned they adapted their attack patterns after encountering. Your security forces, did they show signs of coordinated behavior? Hive mind characteristics? Individual intelligence with shared learning?" "How could you possibly know to ask those questions?" Webb demanded. Blake's expression remained neutral, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Because we've seen these things before. Different worlds, different circumstances, but the same basic threat profile. We've been tracking their spread patterns for about 15 years now." The implications hit Webb like a physical blow. "Spread patterns? You mean there are more infestations out there?" "Dozens that we know of. Possibly hundreds we haven't discovered yet." Blake consulted his tablet, scrolling through data that made Webb's blood run cold. "They're not native to this galaxy. Something brought them here, probably centuries ago as a terraforming weapon or biological mining tool. Most galactic governments classify infected systems as total losses and establish quarantine perimeters. And you? We go in and clean them out." The casual way he said it made Webb's skin crawl. These humans were fighting a secret war across the galaxy, systematically hunting down and exterminating threats that other species simply abandoned as unsolvable problems. Meanwhile, in the ship's medical bay, Colonial Dr. Hayes was getting her own education in human capabilities. The medical technology the humans used was so advanced it seemed like magic, but their treatment philosophy was distinctly practical. We're going to need to run decontamination protocols on everyone who had direct exposure to the creatures, explained the human medical officer, a woman who introduced herself as Commander Park. The acid they secrete contains trace toxins that can cause delayed neurological damage if not treated properly. We didn't know about any toxins, Hayes admitted. Our medical scans showed standard chemical burns, nothing more. Your equipment wouldn't detect these particular compounds, Park said matter-of-factly. They're designed to be invisible to most standard medical sensors. We developed these detection methods after losing several teams to delayed poisoning on other worlds. Again and again, the humans referenced previous encounters with these creatures as if they were discussing routine maintenance rather than life-and-death battles against alien horrors. The human ship's mess hall became an informal, gathering place where colonists could interact with their rescuers. The conversations that took place there challenged everything they thought they knew about the galaxy's power structure. Mining engineer Tom sat across from a human marine named Rodriguez, who was casually eating what appeared to be actual cooked meat rather than the synthesized proteins most species preferred. The Marine's uniform bore patches from campaigns Tom had never heard of, on worlds that weren't in any galactic database. "So you people really do this regularly?" Tom asked. "Hunt down creatures like the ones that attacked us?" Rodriguez nodded, cutting another piece of his meal. "It's what we do. Not just these particular bugs, either. There are dozens of different hostile species that most governments prefer to ignore rather than deal with. We've made it our business to keep them from spreading. But why? These aren't human worlds being threatened. Why risk your people for colonies that aren't even yours? Because if we don't deal with problems when they're small and contained, eventually they become big problems that threaten everyone." Rodriguez's voice carried the patience of someone who had explained this concept many times before. "Besides, we're good at it. It's what we're designed for." That phrase kept coming up in conversations with the humans. It's what we're designed for. Not trained for or equipped for, but designed for, as if violence and warfare were built into their fundamental nature at a genetic level. In the ship's recreation area, Colonial Engineer Davis watched human crew members during their off-duty time. Instead of the quiet, contemplative activities most species preferred for relaxation, the humans engaged in competitive physical contests, strategic games that simulated combat scenarios, and group activities that seemed designed to maintain unit cohesion under stress. Even their entertainment reflected their martial culture. The stories they told each other involved overcoming impossible odds through determination and superior firepower. Their music had driving rhythms that sounded like marching cadences. Their art depicted scenes of heroic struggle against overwhelming enemies. But perhaps most unsettling was their casual attitude toward their own mortality. Davis overheard a conversation between two human technicians discussing casualty projections for upcoming operations with the same detachment that normal species reserved for discussing weather patterns. The briefing estimates 15 to 20% losses for the Vega operation, one said. "That's not too bad. Remember Kepler 442? We lost nearly half the landing force, but we cleared 7 systems in one campaign." They spoke of death and injury as acceptable costs of doing business, calculating human lives in terms of strategic objectives achieved rather than individual tragedies to be avoided. 3 days into the journey to the nearest safe port, Colonial, Supervisor Kale found himself invited to dine with Captain Reed. The captain's private quarters were spartanly furnished but comfortable, with personal items that revealed glimpses of a life spent in constant warfare. Military commendations covered one wall, but they were from conflicts Kale had never heard of. Star charts showed patrol routes through sectors the galactic maps listed as unexplored or quarantined. Most telling of all, a weapons cabinet contained personal armaments that looked more like artillery pieces than small arms. Your people seem to have been fighting this war for a long time, Kale observed. Reed nodded, pouring drinks from a bottle that bore no recognizable label. Longer than most realize, the galaxy has a lot of problems that the major governments prefer to classify as someone else's responsibility. We've made it our responsibility instead. But the cost, the risks. We've heard stories about human military casualty rates. How do you sustain losses like that? Because the alternative is worse, Reed replied simply. We've seen what happens when these threats are allowed to spread unchecked. Better to pay the price now in small battles than later in wars that could consume entire sectors. Through the viewport of Reed's quarters, Kale could see human patrol ships escorting merchant vessels through what the galactic charts listed as a hazardous transit zone. The Deathworlders weren't just fighting their secret war. They were actively protecting trade routes and civilian traffic in areas where other militaries feared to operate. How many of these operations do you run simultaneously? Kale asked. Classified, Reed answered, but her smile suggested the number would be shocking if revealed. Let's just say we stay busy. As the human ship approached the Centauran trade station where the refugees would be transferred to civilian transports, Kale realized they were witnessing something historically significant. The humans weren't just another species trying to carve out territory in the galaxy. They were positioning themselves as the galaxy's unofficial guardians, taking responsibility for threats that other species preferred to ignore. The rescue of Tellus 7 wasn't an isolated act of heroism. It was part of a larger pattern of human intervention in galactic affairs, conducted quietly and efficiently while the major powers focused on politics and trade negotiations. The Deathworlders had responded to their distress call not because they were close by, but because they had ships and personnel positioned throughout the galaxy specifically to respond to exactly these kinds of emergencies. As the transfer procedures began, Kale watched human Marines coordinating with station security with professional efficiency. They moved through the process like people who had done this many times before, in many different systems, under many different circumstances. The galaxy, he realized, was not as unprotected as most people believed. It was just protected by guardians that most species preferred not to acknowledge. The news feeds across the galaxy buzzed with reports of the Tellus 7 incident, but the official statements raised more questions than they answered. Colonial authorities described a successful rescue operation conducted by Allied forces without mentioning which species had actually performed the evacuation. Trade Guild representatives spoke vaguely about pest control measures, while carefully avoiding details about the methods used. Investigative journalist Nix of the Centauran Broadcasting Network smelled a story that went much deeper than routine colony evacuation. Her initial research into the rescue revealed disturbing gaps in the official records. No galactic military had claimed responsibility for the operation. No civilian rescue organization had filed the required paperwork. Most puzzling of all, the orbital bombardment patterns around Tellus 7 showed weapon signatures that didn't match anything in the standard military databases. Her breakthrough came when she cross-referenced shipping manifests from the Tellus 7 system with recent refugee processing records. The survivors had been processed through Centauran Trade Station using documentation that bore the seal of something called Earth Command Humanitarian Operations Division. Most galactic citizens had never heard of Earth Command, but Nix's research revealed it to be the military authority for the quarantined Sol system. The implications sent chills down her spine. The Deathworlders weren't just capable of interstellar operations, they were actively conducting them throughout the galaxy. Her investigation took her to the Outer Rim territories, where rumors and half-whispered stories painted a picture that challenged everything she thought she knew about galactic security. On mining platforms and trading stations, she found people who spoke of mysterious ships appearing during crises, of problems being solved with overwhelming force, of rescues that left behind sterile wastelands where once there had been thriving infestations or pirate bases. Free trader Captain Wells had encountered human forces during a rescue operation in the Vega sector. His cargo hauler had been seized by pirates who demanded ransom for his crew and cargo. Standard procedure would have been to pay the ransom and file insurance claims afterward, but before he could negotiate, a human patrol appeared out of hyperspace. They didn't try to negotiate or demand surrender, Wells told Nix over drinks in a station cantina. They just started shooting. Surgical precision, minimal collateral damage, but absolutely no mercy for the pirates themselves. 20 minutes later, my ship was free and the pirate base was a cloud of expanding debris. What happened to the pirates? What pirates? Wells's expression was grim. The humans don't take prisoners in those situations. Complete elimination of hostile forces is apparently standard operating procedure. Similar stories emerged from across the Rim worlds. Slaver operations that simply vanished overnight. Smuggling rings that disappeared without trace. Pirate bases that were found reduced to molecular slag with no witnesses and no survivors. The pattern was consistent. Overwhelming force applied, with surgical precision, followed by complete sterilization of the target area. But the most disturbing discovery came when Nix accessed classified military intelligence through sources she couldn't name in her reports. The Galactic defense networks showed gaps in coverage that corresponded exactly to areas where human ships had been detected. Entire sectors that were officially listed as too dangerous for normal patrol operations were actually under de facto human protection. The humans hadn't just been responding to individual crises. They had been systematically taking responsibility for problems that the major galactic powers preferred to ignore. Orbital Defense Coordinator Jorel had been tracking anomalous patrol patterns for months before the Tellus 7 incident brought everything into focus. His deep space monitoring stations detected ships moving through hyperspace corridors that were supposed to be uninhabitable or too dangerous for normal traffic. The energy signatures were unlike anything in our databases, he explained to Nix, during a clandestine meeting on a neutral trading station. Heavily armed vessels moving in coordinated formations through areas we've written off as lost causes. At first, we thought it might be some kind of new pirate organization with advanced technology. But you discovered it was the humans. We discovered it was much worse than pirates. Jorel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. They're not just operating in dead zones and quarantined systems. They're actively policing those areas, maintaining order in places where we assumed order was impossible. His data showed the scope of human operations in stark detail, supply lines running through supposedly hostile territory, patrol routes that covered systems the galactic charts listed as uninhabitable. Most shocking of all, established bases and installations in regions that had been abandoned by civilized species decades ago. They've been building an entire parallel infrastructure, Jorel continued. Shipyards, supply depots, command centers, all hidden in systems we don't even monitor anymore. They're not just a quarantined species trying to expand their territory. They're positioning themselves as the galaxy's unofficial military force. The revelation that changed everything came from an unlikely source. Dr. Yan, a xenobiology researcher, studying the creatures that had infested Tellus 7, discovered that the specimens recovered from other worlds showed identical genetic markers. The implications were staggering. This wasn't a series of isolated infestations, but rather a coordinated invasion that had been spreading across the galaxy for decades. The creatures are just the advanced scouts, she explained to Nix via encrypted communication. Their behavior patterns, their adaptation capabilities, their systematic approach to breaking down planetary defenses. This is biological warfare on a galactic scale. Someone or something has been seeding worlds with these organisms as a prelude to larger invasion. And the humans know about this? The humans have been fighting it, Dr. Yan corrected, while the rest of us have been treating each incident as an isolated problem. They've been tracking the pattern and conducting systematic countermeasures. Every world they've cleaned shows the same sterilization protocols, the same thoroughness, the same absolute commitment to complete eradication. The final piece of the puzzle came from the most unlikely source of all, Captain Reed herself. Nix's interview request had been denied through official channels, but a personal message arrived at her private communication address 3 days later. "Meet me at coordinates I'm transmitting separately. Come alone. Bring no recording equipment. If you want the real story, you'll get it, but on our terms." The meeting took place aboard a human ship at the edge of an unnamed system. Reed's vessel was smaller than the massive warship that had responded to Tellus 7, but every surface bristled with weapon systems that could have reduced most civilian stations to scrap metal in minutes. "You've been asking questions about our operations," Reed said without preamble. "Before I answer them, you need to understand the context." What followed was a briefing that fundamentally altered Nix's understanding of galactic politics. The humans had been monitoring extragalactic signals for decades, tracking invasion patterns that suggested coordinated intelligence behind the various threats plaguing frontier worlds. The creature infestations, the pirate raids, the slavers, all of it was connected to a larger pattern of destabilization efforts. "Someone is probing our defenses," Reed explained, activating a holographic display that showed threat vectors spanning multiple sectors. "Testing our response capabilities, measuring our willingness to defend territory we claim as sovereign. The major powers have failed that test repeatedly by abandoning any system that becomes too difficult to defend." "So you've taken over those responsibilities?" "We've accepted them," Reed corrected. "There's a difference. We're not trying to build an empire or claim territory. We're trying to maintain stability in regions where stability is necessary for everyone's survival." The holographic display expanded to show shipping lanes, trade routes, and resource extraction operations that depended on security in supposedly lawless regions. Human operations weren't just cleaning up problems. They were maintaining the infrastructure that allowed galactic civilization to function. "Why keep it secret?" Nix asked. Reed's smile was grim. "Because the moment we go public with these operations, they become political instead of practical. The major powers would demand oversight, want to limit our methods, insist on proportional responses to existential threats. We've seen how that works out." Through the viewport of Reed's ship, Nix could see human patrol vessels escorting a convoy of merchant ships through what her star charts listed as a pirate-infested dead zone. The operation proceeded with clockwork efficiency, ships moving in formation that spoke of extensive training and perfect coordination. "How long have you been doing this?" "Since about 5 years after first contact," Reed answered. "We realized early that the galaxy had a lot of problems that nobody wanted to solve. We decided to solve them anyway, quietly and efficiently, without bothering anyone with messy details like casualty reports or collateral damage assessments." The interview lasted 3 hours, covering operations on dozens of worlds across multiple sectors. By the end, Nix understood that the humans weren't just another spacefaring species trying to find their place in galactic society. They had carved out a role for themselves as the galaxy's exterminators, taking responsibility for threats that others preferred to ignore. As her transport ship departed the rendezvous point, Nix looked back at the human vessel disappearing into hyperspace. On another mission to another world, facing another crisis that would be solved with typical human thoroughness. Her story, when it finally aired, would change everything. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened in the Grand Chamber on Centauri Prime, but the usual pomp and ceremony was replaced by an atmosphere of barely controlled panic. Delegates from 47 different species filled the curved seating arrangements, their various forms of agitation creating a cacophony of clicks, whistles, and harmonics that the universal translator struggled to process. Council Prime Lex called for order with the massive ceremonial gavel, its sound echoing through the chamber like a death knell. The holographic displays around the chamber showed the same troubling data that had prompted this unprecedented gathering. Shipping manifests, patrol reports, and incident summaries that painted a picture no one wanted to acknowledge. We are here to discuss the implications of recent revelations regarding human military activities throughout the galaxy, Lex announced, his voice carrying the weight of someone delivering very bad news. Intelligence reports suggest that the species we quarantined 15 years ago has been conducting systematic operations across multiple sectors without authorization or oversight. Representative Tor of the Centauran hegemony stood to address the assembly, his usually calm demeanor showing stress fractures that were visible even across species lines. The scope of these operations defies comprehension. Our intelligence services have identified human activity in over 300 star systems that we classified as abandoned, quarantined, or uninhabitable. The chamber erupted in alarmed vocalizations from multiple species. 300 systems represented nearly 15% of known space, including some of the galaxy's most strategically important shipping corridors and resource extraction zones. Are you suggesting, called out Delegate Prime Yax of the Core Worlds, that our quarantine protocols have been completely ineffective? Tor's response sent a chill through the assembled representatives. I'm suggesting that the quarantine was never meant to contain them. Analysis of their fleet movements shows deployment patterns consistent with long-term strategic planning. They've been preparing for operations like Tellus 7 for over a decade. Defense Minister Korth of the Outer Rim. Coalition stood abruptly, his massive frame dwarfing the speaking podium. My government has lost contact with 17 monitoring stations in the past 6 months. We assumed they were equipment failures or pirate raids. Now you're telling us the humans might be responsible. Not responsible for destroying them, Tor corrected grimly. Responsible for protecting them. Every station that went dark was located in sectors where we've now identified active human patrol routes. They weren't attacking our infrastructure. They were defending it better than we were. The implications sent shockwaves through the chamber. If the humans were actively protecting galactic infrastructure without authorization, it meant the major powers had been accepting their protection without even realizing it. Fleet Admiral Rex of the Combined Defense Force activated the main display, showing patrol patterns that had been compiled from months of sensor data. The humans have been operating a parallel military structure that puts our own forces to shame. Look at these response times. The data was undeniable. Human forces consistently arrived at crisis points hours or even days before official military units could respond. Their casualty rates were lower despite engaging in significantly more dangerous operations. Most troubling of all, their success rates approached 100% in every category of threat they encountered. How is this possible? Demanded Trade Delegate Lin of the Commercial Guild. Our combined fleets represent the military might of nearly 50 different species. How could one planet mount operations on this scale? The answer came from an unexpected source. Dr. Wells, the xenobiology expert who had been studying the Tellus 7 creatures, had been granted permission to address the Council directly. Her findings represented the most disturbing revelation yet. The threats they've been fighting aren't random, she announced, activating her own set of displays. Genetic analysis of specimens from 17 different worlds shows identical manipulation, signatures. These infestations are artificial, created by the same intelligence using the same biotechnology. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. The galaxy wasn't facing random outbreaks of dangerous organisms. It was under coordinated biological attack by an unknown intelligence. The humans have been fighting an invasion, Dr. Wells continued. While we've been treating each incident as an isolated problem requiring individual solutions, they've been tracking the source and conducting systematic countermeasures. They're not just rescuing colonies or clearing infestations. They're fighting a war. Communications. Director Vale stood at his station, his multiple arms working frantically at control interfaces as priority signals flooded the Council's emergency channels. We're receiving reports from across the galaxy. Systems that have been dark for years are suddenly showing signs of renewed activity. Trade routes that we abandoned as too dangerous are now reporting normal traffic flow. The main display shifted to show a real-time galactic map with activity indicators that painted a picture none of them were prepared to accept. Human ships were everywhere, maintaining security in regions where official military forces hadn't operated in decades. They weren't hiding their operations anymore. They were announcing their presence to the galaxy. This is Captain Reed of Earth Command, broadcasting on all galactic emergency frequencies. The voice that filled the chamber was calm, professional, and utterly confident. We are transmitting updated sector control information to all civilian and military authorities. Please adjust your navigation databases accordingly. What followed was a systematic announcement of human military responsibility for over 400 star systems, including detailed patrol schedules, emergency contact, procedures, and threat assessment protocols. It wasn't a declaration of war or territorial expansion. It was a simple statement of fact. These areas were under human protection and had been for years. The reaction in the council chamber ranged from outrage to terror to grudging admiration. The humans hadn't conquered territory through invasion or negotiation. They had simply accepted responsibility for regions that everyone else had abandoned and done such an effective job that most people hadn't even noticed. They're not asking for permission, observed military analyst Zone with something approaching awe. They're informing us of an existing situation. Representative Tor activated his personal communication device and requested a direct channel to Earth Command. The response came immediately, as if they had been expecting the call. This is Admiral Chen of Earth Command Operations. I assume you have questions about our recent broadcast. We demand an explanation for unauthorized military operations in sovereign space, Tor began, falling back on diplomatic protocol. Sovereign space? Admiral Chen's voice carried a note of polite skepticism. According to our records, most of the systems in question were officially abandoned by your governments between 5 and 15 years ago. We simply prevented them from becoming permanent threat sources. The exchange that followed revealed the scope of human planning and preparation. They had documented evidence of every system abandonment, every failed defense operation, every decision by galactic authorities to write off territory rather than defend it. Their operations weren't violations of sovereignty. They were responses to power vacuums that threatened galactic stability. What do you want from us? Council Prime Lex asked, cutting through the diplomatic posturing. Nothing, Admiral Chen replied. We're not seeking recognition, territorial concessions, or political integration. We're simply informing you that certain regions are secure and will remain secure as long as we maintain responsibility for them. And if we object to your presence in those regions, the pause that followed was pregnant with implications. When Admiral Chen spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Then you're welcome to resume responsibility for defending them yourselves. We'll withdraw our forces immediately upon receipt of your formal assumption of security duties. The challenge was clear, and everyone in the chamber understood its implications. The galactic powers could demand human withdrawal from the systems they were protecting, but only if they were prepared to assume responsibility for defending those same systems against threats they had already proven incapable of handling. The vote, when it finally came, was unanimous. The Galactic Council formally recognized human security operations in specified sectors, not because they approved of human methods, but because the alternative was chaos. 6 months later, Colonial Administrator Webb stood on the observation, deck of Haven Station, watching human and alien workers collaborate on mining operations that extracted resources from previously inaccessible deposits. The station bore little resemblance to the desperate refugee camp that Tellus 7 had become during the creature infestation. Her communication console chimed with an incoming message from Earth Command. Additional biological threats detected in the Rigel sector. Response fleet deploying. Civilian evacuation recommended for affected systems. Webb looked out at the bustling station, at the mixed crews working on projects that generated wealth for dozens of different species, and realized that the galaxy had fundamentally changed. The humans hadn't conquered anyone or demanded tribute. They had simply made themselves indispensable by accepting responsibilities that no one else wanted. The Deathworlders had responded to the galaxy's cry for help with typical human efficiency. They had solved the immediate problem and then systematically addressed every related problem they could find. Their answer to the distress call from Tellus 7 hadn't been a single rescue ship. It had been a promise that nowhere in the galaxy would ever be truly beyond help again, backed by the kind of overwhelming force projection that made such promises believable. And that promise, delivered with human precision and maintained through human determination, had become the foundation of galactic security, whether anyone officially acknowledged it or not. The humans had heard the galaxy's cry for help and responded not with temporary assistance, but with permanent protection. The age of human guardianship had begun, and the galaxy was still trying to decide whether that was salvation or something far more complex.